after the show actually approached and informed the captain that he could outshoot him. Now, the captain could not help but laugh at the arrogant young man, because for as much of a blowhard as he was, Bogardus was actually a Civil War vet and a proficient marksman who had performed for European royalty in 1878 as the, quote, master manipulator of the shotgun and champion wing shot of the world. In fact, the captain had even toured with Buffalo Bill Cody and Annie Oakley for a time, making a living off his skills as a marksman. Granted, though, the captain was 75 years old now, and not quite the same man who had, over the course of 6 hours, broken 4,844 glass targets out of 5,000 in New York City, but still the suggestion that this young whippersnapper could outshoot him seemed ridiculous. So the captain challenged the boy to prove himself, figuring that the lad could use a bit of humbling. Yet, when Alvin stuck one of the pie tins to a fence post some 20 paces away and started shooting at it, the captain would be sufficiently impressed by this display to offer the boy a job as the medicine show's new sharpshooter. So Alvin now joined the medicine show, as it made his circuit around Missouri, Arkansas, Oklahoma, and Kansas, with Alvin putting on a show shooting various fruits, vegetables, and pie tins, while the captain extolled the virtues of his miraculous concoction and all the ailments it could cure. Alvin would even reportedly develop a new shooting feat as he started shooting a silver dollar he tossed into the air. This, however, was more a trick than a display of his shooting ability. You see, after Alvin showed the crowd an intact silver dollar, he'd palm that coin and instead toss one that already had a hole in it. Alvin then would only fire his gun for show, and oftentimes aimed it nowhere near the coin, as he realized that the crowd's entire attention was on the coin and not him once he tossed it, as Alvin further learned how easy it could be to trick people. Alvin would then take whatever he made from the medicine show and wager it playing poker and dice games in whatever town they were in, more often than not coming out ahead when he did so. Alvin, though, seemingly could not stay any one place for too long, and even though this was a traveling show, after about a year of this work, the young man started feeling the itch to move on. So, after arriving in Memphis, Alvin informed the captain that after this next show he was setting off on his own, as it was apparently time for the young man to lean completely into being a traveling gambler. Now, Alvin was already well on his way toward this life, as he spent most of his nights out on the town fighting and betting in local gambling halls, but now he was intent on this being his only job. He wanted no other distractions. Gambling was his life, and Memphis was a great place to start his new career due to its thriving nightlife. Alvin then would find plenty of places to gamble here while also developing a love for the blues. He also, though, started to earn a bit of a reputation for how often he won. So, while basing himself in Memphis, Alvin also took to traveling about on trains and riverboats, always looking for the next game and the next person with too much money and not enough restraint. In fact, Alvin seemed to find exactly this type of man when he heard of a riverboat operator named Joe Green. Green, you see, had a reputation for betting on anything and everything, but he especially loved playing dice on his riverboat, the Rambler. Alvin then met up with the boat and its owner in Mark Tree, Arkansas, and wasn't long then after he boarded that Alvin got to talking with Green, and soon enough the topic of conversation shifted to dice. Green, of course, loved to gamble, and so he wondered if his young passenger played as well. After responding that he played every now and again, Alvin was invited to play a few games with Green. The thing was, as much as the owner of the Rambler loved to gamble, he simply wasn't very good at it, and by the time the boat had made 3 trips up and down the St. Francis River, Alvin had already won $2,000, which was reportedly every cent that Green had on the boat with him. It was at this point that Green, still not realizing how in over his head that he was, offered to bet his boat, which he figured was worth $2,500, in an attempt to win back the money he had already lost. As you might expect then, this didn't exactly pan out the way that Green wanted, and so Alvin now found himself the owner of the Rambler. Now, young Alvin had no idea what to do with the boat, so he offered his former owner a chance to work for him. Likely seething quietly, Green then continued to navigate what used to be his boat up and down the river, as this kid, his new boss, either played cards with other gamblers or spent his time entertaining a local girl named Nellie Harris, who he was apparently quite taken with. This included holding a party on the boat in Nellie's honor, a party which Green asked if he could invite a friend of his named Jim Johnson to attend. Now, this may seem like a strange ask, but Alvin had heard of this Johnson and his reputation for being a gambler, so he agreed. The thing was, while Johnson was indeed a gambler of some repute, he was also known as a tough customer and a mean drunk. With that in mind, you won't be surprised to learn that after losing $50 to the young man shortly after setting off, Johnson drunkenly rose to his feet and pulled a knife. Johnson then declared that Alvin was a cheater who had, in addition to robbing him of $50, had also stolen his friend's boat. For these crimes, he threatened to cut the boy's head off as he drove the young man backwards until Alvin toppled overboard in his attempts to avoid the drunken man's knife. Seeing Alvin fall into the river amused the very drunk Johnson to no end, and so he put his knife away. Now Alvin would eventually make his way back on board the Rambler, but when he did, he found Nellie in tears, as Johnson, who had kept getting drunker, was threatening and maybe even attempting to rip her clothes off as he declared that he wanted to see what was underneath. Alvin then probably ordered Green to take them all home, before turning his full attention to Johnson, who at this point had once again begun to threaten him with his knife. Alvin responded to this escalating situation by grabbing a hammer and striking the other man with it in his head, leaving Johnson staggered and senseless as he leaned against the rail of the boat. The young man, however, did not stop there, as instead he struck the drunk 3 to 4 more times before shoving Johnson's limp form over the railing and into the river, where he subsequently drowned since his dead body would be found 2 days later. Now, Johnson was clearly a terrible person, but still, if the story is true, Alvin could have seemingly stopped after the first or even second blow, and he certainly did not need to shove him overboard when he was unconscious and sure to drown. It was at this point then that Joe Green's friend, the sheriff of Poinsett, arrested Alvin for murder. The sheriff did more than just arrest him, though, as he also personally put the young man on trial. With 4 locals acting as the jury, the lawman acted as both judge and prosecution. The sheriff then laid out the quote-unquote evidence they had of Alvin's guilt before he ordered the jury to find the young man guilty of murder. Now, to be clear, this trial involved no physical evidence, witnesses, or even a defense lawyer, but still the 4 did as they were told. At which point the sheriff informed Alvin that his punishment was going to either be the noose, or he could hand over all the money he had won and sign over the deed to the Rambler and get out of town immediately. Alvin then obviously took the latter option, as he handed over his winnings including the boat and got out of there. Yet despite taking a life and having his own put on the line, nothing really seemed to change about the young man. He simply continued to travel and gamble just as he always had. He even kept asking after Lee Thomas wherever he went. A search that Alvin would claim actually came to fruition in the boomtown of Oil City, which sat on the Texas-Louisiana border. It was here, either through happenstance or through a tip he had gained elsewhere, that Alvin came upon a game of poker being dealt by a man with a similar tall build as his own. Noticing the young man hovering about their game, Alvin was invited to join, which he did without ever introducing himself or giving his name to his companions. The game would carry on throughout the night, with Alvin predictably winning more than his fair share as the other players, for one reason or another, began walking away. Until, finally, after Alvin had reportedly won some $3,600, the dealer, one Lee Thomas, demanded to know the name of the stranger who had taken so much money from him. It was at this point that the young man announced that he was Alvin Thomas, Lee's son, and he was giving him his money back. Lee was said to have been both shocked and amused at being cleaned out by his own son, who he then embraced. According to Alvin then, he and his father then teamed up for several weeks, as they cheated various oil field workers out of their pay at the gambling tables. Yet apparently the two had little in common, and Lee even stole some of his son's money while he thought he was sleeping. Between this and not really being comfortable in the little oil boomtown, Alvin soon set off on his own, leaving his father behind much like Lee had done to him all those years before. Or at least that's what Alvin would claim for years and years. In fact, he would tell the story for the rest of his life, before finally admitting privately to one of his own sons that none of this ever happened. While Alvin had searched for his father for years, he never did find any signs of where he had disappeared to after leaving his family behind. So, Alvin just made up this story as he looked to construct his own legend, as this way he wasn't just some boy whose father had left him as a baby. He had grown up, tracked down his old man, and won both his money and his approval before ultimately deciding to leave him behind. Alvin would then further build upon this legend when he turned 19 and visited Joplin, Missouri in 1912. To note, Alvin was not just here on happenstance. Instead, he had been explicitly invited to Joplin by the owner at the town's bank, a Mr. Polston. Polston, you see, enjoyed playing poker, but he wasn't very good at it, as he lost more than his fair share of hands to the local card sharps, which was why he wanted young Alvin to come to town. While Mr. Polston wasn't a great card player himself, he could recognize talent when he saw it, and he wanted the 19-year-old to get a little revenge for him. Basically, his plan was he would finance the boys' gambling in return for a small cut of his winnings. He mainly just wanted to give the local sharps a taste of their own medicine while making a little money in the process. While Pilston was confident in the young man's skills, he still started to grow worried, as he for a week or so did quite a bit more losing than he did winning. Alvin, though, insisted he was just baiting the hook, letting the other men think they had gotten his measure and allowing them to grow overconfident. It was at this point he insisted that once the bets got big enough, he would start playing for real. And indeed, the boy did eventually start winning significant amounts of money off the local card sharps. In doing so, though, Alvin always made sure to lose from time to time to keep the others interested and thinking they had a chance. The trick was he only ever lost the small pots, but whenever the money got big enough, he would win without fail. Mr. Polston then would be delighted by the progress the young man was making, not realizing that part of the reason why the 19-year-old had been taking so long baiting the hook was because he had been prolonging the dalliance he was having with Polston's 16-year-old daughter, who, as it turns out, had been quite taken by the tall, lanky, well-dressed young gambler, as he told her stories about his exciting life, bought her gifts, and subsequently spent more than a few afternoons together in her bedroom. Alvin, though, as he would constantly do throughout his life, started to grow restless. He just did not like staying in one place for too long. Plus, it didn't help that he was developing a bit of a reputation among the local gamblers as someone you shouldn't bet against. You see, in addition to cleaning out a number of them at cards, he also supposedly won a very improbable bet with some of the locals he liked to go fishing with in the afternoon. These men, like Alvin, were also gamblers, and so they seemingly couldn't help themselves when the 19-year-old proclaimed that the sign that said 20 miles to Joplin had to be wrong. Alvin, you see, kept insisting they couldn't be more than 15 miles outside of town, while the others were confident the sign had to be right, as you wouldn't just place something like that willy-nilly without being sure of the actual distance. As such, none of them so much as blinked when Alvin bet them $1,000 that he was right. Two men even supposedly raised a bet to $5,000, only to be frustrated when the odometer in their car showed that they had in fact only been 15 miles outside of Joplin. Alvin then had been right, but only because he had spent the day before moving the sign 5 miles closer to town. After this incident, though, the others had far less interest in making a bet against the 19-year-old. So, with his prospects drying up and Alvin not being the type for commitment, he informed the banker's daughter that he was leaving. She, however, reportedly insisted they spend one final afternoon together. The two, however, had apparently just gotten undressed when both of the 16-year-old girl's parents unexpectedly returned home. Alvin then got the sense that he really should get out of town, as even if Mr. Polston, the girl's father, seemed inclined on continuing their business arrangement, he'd still rather not have to deal with her angry mother. Before leaving Joplin, however, Alvin reportedly stopped in at Snow Clark's pool hall, where he proceeded to outshoot pretty much everyone in the joint, before asking who was the, quote, best cue in town. In response, the locals unanimously proclaimed that to be none other than the proprietor of the pool hall, Snow Clark himself. Alvin then reportedly challenged Clark to a game, betting him $500, a tidy sum in those days when you could get a steak dinner complete with a dessert of pie and ice cream for a single dollar. Now, the fact that he'd just beaten pretty much everyone in the place, not to mention the size of the proposed bet, should have been a warning for Snow Clark, but he was confident in his own abilities. Plus, the young man's twangy Ozark accent may have made him seem foolish or simple enough to make such a bet without thinking of the consequences. So the bet was made, and soon the young man had been the best pool player in town. Before making his exit, though, Alvin reportedly happened to catch sight of a sign on the door of the pool hall that read, quote, $200 to any man who jumps over my new pool table. The table in question was 4.5 feet wide and 2.5 feet tall, making it a hell of a leap, and one that even if you managed to make would probably result in some kind of disastrous crash landing on the other side. Which is why Snow and everyone else in the pool hall laughed as the departing boy announced that he could do it, as he could, quote, outjump a herd of bullfrogs. While they were laughing, though, the young man walked away, leaving Snow and the others confused. Round about 10 minutes later, though, Alvin returned dragging a mattress from a nearby cheap hotel behind him that he then laid on the opposite side of the table. Alvin then backed up and with a running start managed to leap flipping over the table before landing on the mattress on the other side. It was supposedly following this display that Alvin earned his nickname, as when Snow Clark was asked what that boy's name had been, he was said to have responded, quote, I don't rightly know, but it ought to be Titanic. He sinks everybody. in what was a timely reference as the doomed White Star liner had famously sunk several weeks earlier despite its unsinkable moniker, and so the legend grew as he now had an appropriate name.